My name is Charlotte Mendez. I'm 29 years old, and 3 hours before I was supposed to walk down the aisle in my white satin dress, I found out that my mother had been sleeping with my fiancé. There was no screaming, no throwing of the bouquet, no lipstick-smeared confrontations, just silence, cold, heavy silence like the kind you hear before a storm that doesn't just destroy your house, but rewrites the landscape. 3 hours. That's how long it took for everything I believed in love, loyalty, family to collapse like a paper cathedral. I'd spent years building a future with Adam, 6 of them, to be exact. We met in law school, when I still thought respect was earned and not demanded. He was warm, charming, attentive, the kind of man who looked at you like you were the only book he'd ever want to read again. And my mother, Elaine, 60, flawless in public, venomous in private. The kind of woman who called her own daughter too intense, too sensitive, and too proud. She always smiled with her teeth but never with her eyes. But she played the mother of the bride perfectly. She helped pick the flowers, argued about ivory versus cream napkins, insisted on paying for my wedding shoes because, in her words, every woman deserves to stand tall on her big day. She must have laughed herself to sleep after saying that. I found out about the affair by mistake. That morning, I had gone back to the hotel suite to pick up the perfume bottle I'd forgotten. The room was empty, or so I thought. My stylist had stepped out. The dress was hanging on the door, and Adam's phone was buzzing violently on the marble countertop. I never checked his phone. I wasn't that woman, but the name E flashed again and again, and something inside me, something cold and sharp like cracked porcelain, told me to look. I wish I could unsee what I saw. They weren't just messages. They were confessions, photos, references to things that only someone with access to our home and my childhood could know. He called her goddess. She called him young lion. I think I threw up in my mouth. I sat on the edge of the tub for a full 20 minutes, just breathing, or trying to. There were no tears, only this sterile awareness that something had snapped, clean and silent, like a string under tension for years. I didn't call off the wedding. I didn't text anyone. I closed the phone, placed it back exactly as it was, and picked up my perfume. Then I stood in front of the mirror and sprayed myself twice, once for the girl who used to believe in love, and once for the woman who was about to bury her. The ceremony began exactly at 4. The guests were seated. My father, who had no idea of any of this, smiled at me like I was walking into a new life. I was, just not the one they expected. I walked slowly. I made eye contact with Adam. He looked nervous, but not guilty. That takes a certain kind of training, doesn't it? My mother sat in the front row, dressed like a queen. No crown, just a stolen man and a lifetime of secrets. The priest asked if we had prepared our vows. Adam said yes. I nodded. Then I turned to my mother and handed her the microphone. You wrote them, I said softly. You should say them. There was a gasp in the crowd. The priest froze. Adam looked like someone had poured acid into his collar. My mother, God, the way her face cracked, I think that was the first honest expression I'd seen from her in years. I didn't wait for her to speak. I turned around and walked back down the aisle. No music, no tears, just silence and my footsteps echoing through a room full of stunned strangers and one man I thought I loved. Outside, I took off the heels she bought me and walked barefoot into the car. The driver asked where to. I didn't answer. I just whispered, anywhere but here. 3 hours. That's all it took to rewrite my entire life, and I hadn't even started yet. 3 days passed without anyone hearing from me. The tabloids speculated, family members called, and Adam, from what I heard later, stood by our shared apartment like a dog who couldn't understand why the door no longer opened for him. But I wasn't hiding. I was rebuilding, in silence, in control, with a calm that frightened even myself. When you've been shattered in the exact place you were supposed to be celebrated, something inside you calcifies. It doesn't break again. It sharpens. And that sharpness guided every step I took from that moment on. I wasn't Charlotte Mendez anymore, not really. The woman who picked centerpieces, who rehearsed her first dance in the living room, who tried on 20 veils just to make her mother smile. That woman had died in a bridal suite with a bottle of perfume in her hand and a screen full of betrayal in her lap. The woman who rose after her didn't cry. She documented, she printed, she filed. I went straight to the courthouse that Monday morning, wearing the same dress I wore to my bar exam, simple, professional, and invincible. I walked in alone, but I left with 3 certified copies of a petition for name correction and family disassociation. Most people don't know you can do that, but with the right legal arguments and a complete absence of emotional hesitation, the law lets you surgically remove a name from your birth certificate like a tumor. I wasn't erasing her because I was ashamed of being her daughter. I was erasing her because I never was. Not truly. Not in the way mothers are supposed to stand beside daughters. Not in the way they're supposed to protect them from fire instead of lighting the match. Elaine never wanted a daughter. She wanted a mirror. And when I refused to reflect her weakness, her hunger, her insatiable need to be desired no matter the cost, she broke me quietly over the years, comment by comment, glance by glance, comparison by comparison, until she realized she couldn't control me anymore. So she tried to seduce what I loved. She succeeded, but not for long. I didn't just file the petition. I had the court summon her for the hearing, and I made sure the notice was delivered in person, at her yoga retreat, while she was still pretending to be the grieving mother of a runaway bride. I heard she fainted, or pretended to. It didn't matter. The hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning, and I stood in the courtroom in front of a tired but attentive judge, presenting my case with the precision of a woman who had rehearsed every syllable in her sleep. I didn't cry. I didn't mention the affair. I focused on the patterns: abandonment, gaslighting, undermining behavior, strategic emotional harm over decades. I used the words the court would understand: psychological neglect, sustained coercion, relational breach. But what I meant was, she gutted me from the inside and smiled while doing it. When the judge granted the petition, I didn't blink. I thanked him, turned, and walked out. On the steps of the courthouse, I held the new document in my hands. A legal copy of my life with her name removed. No longer Elaine's daughter. No longer tethered by blood or paper. I thought I would feel free, but what I felt was something deeper, something colder, a silence that tasted like control. And that silence became my compass. I sent copies of the certificate to every institution that had ever addressed me by her last name: banks, insurance, alma mater, even the post office. I wasn't hiding. I was erasing her footprint from my life like a crime scene cleanup. When the first letter came back addressed to Charlotte Alden, my new legal name, I smiled for the first time in days. Alden was my grandmother's maiden name, the only woman who ever held me like I mattered. She died when I was 13, and I remember her once telling me, "Don't ever let a woman like your mother tell you who you are." She never imagined how literal that would become. That weekend, I mailed a copy of the updated birth certificate to my mother's house. No letter, no return address, just the document and a single post-it note on top of it, with the handwriting she taught me to perfect and the words, "This is the last thing we'll ever share." She didn't respond, not directly. But 2 days later, a call came from Adam's number. I didn't answer. Then one from a blocked number. Then a voice message, her voice tight, flat, pretending not to be shaken. "We need to talk, Charlotte. You're overreacting. This is bigger than you realize." That was the first time I laughed in weeks. Not because it was funny, because she still thought she had the upper hand. But I was no longer reacting. I was planning, with a new name, new fire, and a silence she couldn't read. From that moment on, I didn't share a single breath with either of them unless it was legally mandated or part of a larger design. The wedding hadn't just been canceled. It had been reprogrammed, rewritten as the starting point of a war waged in gestures, in documents, in poetic, irreversible losses. They thought I had walked away, but the truth is, I had simply walked ahead, and they hadn't even noticed they were standing on a trapdoor. It began in the back of a filing cabinet I hadn't opened in years. The one I kept at the old apartment above the garage, where sunlight barely touched the floor and the windows always seemed to creak like they knew secrets no one had the courage to ask about. Inside, between outdated utility bills and graduation certificates I no longer cared to frame, was a sealed envelope with my father's handwriting on the front, soft, disciplined strokes that still carried the smell of ink and pipe tobacco, even after a decade. It read, "For Charlotte when she's ready." I hadn't been ready when he died. I hadn't been ready when my mother boxed up his clothes while his scent still lingered in the bedroom. I hadn't been ready when she emptied his side of the closet before the funeral flowers had even withered. But now I was. My fingers trembled when I opened it, not from sadness, but from a bone-deep anticipation, like I already knew that what I was about to read would become the next step in my war. My father had been quiet, loving, and most importantly meticulous. He had left behind a revised will, notarized and binding, naming me the primary beneficiary of all assets held in trust, with a specific addendum. Elaine Mendez was to receive nothing unless explicitly approved by me. I remember standing completely still after reading it, the air tightening around me like a corset. My father, even in death, had seen her for what she was, and in his own silent way, had handed me the matchbook. I spent the next week gathering every legal tool I needed to execute his wishes with surgical elegance. I met with the trustee. I reviewed the terms. I reactivated the dormant charitable clause he had written in during his final weeks, the one designed to fund causes supporting women escaping domestic and emotional abuse. But I altered it just slightly. A new name for the fund, the Alden Initiative. And one additional clause, personally signed by me, using my new legal identity. No disbursement of funds may, under any circumstance, be directed to process by, or benefit Elaine Mendez or any entity she represents. The lawyer raised an eyebrow. Personal? He asked. I smiled without smiling. Poetic? The estate was significant. My father had been modest in life but smart with money. Real estate, long-term investments, royalties from a technical patent I never understood, all of it now had my signature on it. And every penny that once whispered her name was now redirected like a river carved through stone, towards shelters she never cared to acknowledge, support centers she once mocked in cocktail conversations, and women she would never dare call her equals. I didn't call her. I didn't inform her. I waited. And soon enough, the calls came not from her, but from her lawyer. A confused, jittery man who tried to sound authoritative when he said, "Your mother has questions regarding the execution of her late husband's estate." I let him speak. I let him repeat himself when I didn't answer. And then I said, "She was never his widow. She was a placeholder. The documents confirm it." He hung up, but I knew she'd read between the lines. I imagined her pacing her white-tiled kitchen, manicured fingers trembling around a glass of Chardonnay she used to judge me for refusing. I imagined her pulling out old photo albums, flipping through glossy lies that couldn't save her now. I imagined her dialing Adam's number in desperation, thinking he could fix it, not knowing that he too was already on my list. Then I imagined something else, her opening her mailbox and finding the brochure. Not for a spa, not for a gala, but for a fundraiser. Join us for the inaugural night of the Alden Initiative, in honor of Charlotte Alden's father, who believed every woman deserved to be safe even from her own family. I made sure her name was nowhere on the guest list. I made sure she received the invitation. And I made sure her local paper ran the story the same week. It wasn't about money. It was about rewriting lineage. My father's legacy would no longer rot inside the same house that had decayed under her smile. It would breathe in shelters with chipped walls and hopeful eyes. It would sleep in beds offered to women who had only ever known floors. It would whisper to them, "You are not weak for surviving. You are dangerous for still standing." That whisper was mine now. In giving away everything she thought was hers, I had taken back everything she tried to steal from me, and she couldn't even touch it. Not legally, not emotionally, not even in memory. Because the plaque at the entrance of the first shelter opened by the Alden Initiative bore only one name, for the daughter who chose fire over silence, mine. The florist called me 2 days before the wedding, her voice tight and uncomfortable, the kind of tone that carries the weight of someone who knows they're being used but can't afford to say no. She asked, as delicately as she could, if I was sure I no longer wanted peonies. I was confused. I had never changed my mind. Peonies were the one flower I had insisted on since childhood, the symbol of everything soft and radiant I had dreamed of being on my wedding day. I still remembered pressing their petals in the pages of books my grandmother left behind, petals that smelled like spring and dignity and the kind of femininity that doesn't beg to be loved. But the florist explained that someone had already called and canceled them, replacing them with lilies, Elaine's favorite. I didn't even flinch. It made sense. She couldn't be the bride, so she rewrote the bouquet. She had already taken the man. Why not take the symbol too? At the time, I let it pass. There were bigger betrayals to triage, but betrayal doesn't die. It stores itself quietly until it's needed again. Months later, after I'd processed the legal severing of TIs and redirected the inheritance, I found myself back in my grandmother's hometown in Old Mill Town in upstate Vermont, where no one knew my story, only my new name. I stayed in her old cottage, restored it with the money she left me secretly, The money Elaine had tried to claim was misplaced in probate. And one morning, with the early sun catching the frost on the window pane, I drove to a nursery and asked for every peony root they had. Planning a wedding? The young woman asked brightly. I smiled softly. Something like that? I had the roots shipped to a small school near the edge of town. It was the same school Elaine had forced me to leave at 13 because, in her words, no daughter of mine will attend a school where they encourage tares. I'd cried once in class, when I was overwhelmed with anxiety from a presentation. I had been pulled out the next week. I never forgot that. The school had recently begun a program to support girls with emotional trauma, small group therapy, art healing, emotional literacy. I donated anonymously, then personally oversaw the design of the garden. It would be planted right at the entrance, where every child and parent would see it upon arriving. Rows and rows of peonies in every color they had denied me. I paid for a plaque stone, subtle, not gilded or ornamental. It read, "For the girls who were told to stop crying, bloom anyway." The day the garden was unveiled, the headmistress invited me to attend. I wore the same heels Elaine had bought for my wedding, now scratched from long walks and courtroom visits. I didn't want to waste them. I stood in the back, near a tree, watching as girls ran between the flowers, brushing their fingers against the soft petals like they were touching something sacred. I didn't cry. Not there. Not yet. I waited until I was back in the car, staring at my hands, remembering the weight of the bridal bouquet that was never mine, the one made of lilies instead of peonies, the one that smelled like theft. I wondered how many moments in my life had been stolen without me noticing, and how many more I could take back. That evening, I sent a photo of the garden to my mother. No caption, no context. Just the image of her least favorite flower blooming wildly, defiantly, in a place she had once deemed unworthy of her daughter. She didn't respond. But the next week, I received an email from an old friend of hers, an etiquette columnist from a small lifestyle magazine, asking if I'd be willing to do a piece on legacy gardens. I declined, politely. Because this wasn't about publication. It was about permanence. Peonies take time to root. The first year, they often don't bloom. They wait, quietly, patiently. They teach you something about revenge, about how real beauty isn't rushed, it's buried deep, until it's ready to rise on its own terms. My mother tried to erase that softness from me. She thought emotion was weakness. But peonies are strong. They bloom through frost, through time, through grief. And when they open, they don't whisper. They burst, loud and full and impossible to ignore. Just like I was learning to. It was buried in a folder labeled Wedding Final Draft, inside a shared cloud drive we had all used during the months of planning. The folder was meant for things like seating charts, song lists, vendor contracts, the soft, forgettable bones of a celebration meant to look effortless. But someone had forgotten to scrub it clean after the wreckage. Or maybe they thought I'd never come back to look. That I'd be too broken, too quiet, too obedient to dig through the wreckage with my own hands. They forgot who raised me. Or maybe they didn't realize I'd already unlearned her teachings. It was a video file, unlabeled, hidden behind layers of menus and permissions. I found it on a slow Tuesday afternoon, months after the failed wedding, while organizing loose ends with a lawyer who asked if I still wanted access to the shared drive. Curiosity did what grief never could. It opened a door. The file was short, just under 4 minutes, but it played like a confession. It was a recording from one of the private fittings, one I wasn't present for. My mother had insisted on overseeing the final tweaks of my dress, claiming she wanted it to be just perfect on the big day. She was always playing the part of the doting mother in front of strangers. What I hadn't known, what the recording showed, was that Adam had shown up during the appointment, not to surprise me, but to meet her, alone. The camera had been set up by the seamstress for internal documentation. No one had thought to delete it. Or maybe no one remembered it existed. The video showed them standing too close, speaking too softly. Her hand grazed his sleeve as she whispered something I couldn't hear, but I didn't need subtitles to understand. The intimacy was unbearable. Then she laughed. Not her public laugh, the laugh she used when she knew no one else was watching. She tilted her head and said, "She's not ready for you." But I've always been ready. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't the betrayal. I already knew about that. It was the ease, the casualness, the certainty in her voice that I would never be enough, not for him, not for her, not for anyone. She had never wanted me to shine, just to orbit her, to reflect her glory, never cast my own. I downloaded the file, encrypted it, and stored it in 3 separate backups. Then I sat with it for 6 days, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted the release to be perfect. Elaine ran a small YouTube channel. It was part lifestyle, part public therapy, part curated fantasy. She called it Refined Living with Elaine. Weekly videos on aging gracefully, mother-daughter bonding tips, interior design on a budget. Thousands of middle-aged women watched her with admiration, never knowing the steel behind her smile. I had never appeared on the channel. She said I was too serious for her audience, that I didn't photograph well under natural lighting. Now I was ready for my debut. I waited until the day her newest episode was set to premiere a tutorial on assembling an autumn floral arrangement with grace and dignity. I used an old login she had once given me when I helped her set up the channel's analytics. She never bothered to change the password. Within minutes, I had access to the back end. She had already scheduled her video. I simply replaced the file. My title, For the Women She Lied to. My thumbnail, a still of her hand on Adam's shoulder, frozen mid-laugh. My description, no daughter deserves this. No woman should be fooled by appearances. Then I scheduled it for Sunday morning, 9 o'clock a.m. prime engagement. I didn't watch it go live. I went to a bookstore, ordered coffee, bought a hardback edition of Sylvia Plath and sat in the garden of a museum my mother had once banned me from visiting because she said melancholy was a waste of energy. My phone buzzed relentlessly, first once, then dozens, then hundreds. I didn't check, not until hours later, when the sun was already dimming and the air felt like paper curling at the edges. Her channel had been suspended. The video, however, had already been mirrored. Viewers had downloaded it, re-uploaded it, commented thousands of times. You destroyed your daughter. How dare you pretend to be a mother? This is abuse in pearls. But the most common comment was only 3 words long. We believe her. Elaine tried to issue a statement later. Claims she had been manipulated, misrepresented, taken out of context. But the internet doesn't care for posturing when the raw footage speaks louder. The footage didn't just destroy her reputation. It unraveled the myth she had built. Because people didn't just see a betrayal, they saw a pattern. A woman who demanded perfection, crushed softness, and rewrote loyalty to suit her needs. They saw what I had lived with. They saw me. I never spoke publicly about it. I didn't need to. I let her channel die in silence, buried under the weight of her own performance. She had always treated motherhood as a stage. I just raised the curtain and let the audience see the actress behind the costume. It was the same resort Elaine used to show off in her charity luncheons, the kind with fake orchids on every table and photos of her holding champagne glasses next to women she barely tolerated. She called it a sanctuary for the refined, as if glass balconies and imported linens could make someone decent. That was the place she chose for their honeymoon, not mine. Theirs, booked with Adam's platinum card, labeled Charlotte and Adam Honeymoon Suite on the travel agency's receipt, even after I had already burned my dress. They didn't even bother hiding it. I found the itinerary when the resort emailed the final confirmation to an old shared inbox we used during the wedding planning. One they forgot was still connected to my personal email. I opened it on a Wednesday morning, between black coffee and a dead plant on my windowsill. The subject line was gentle. Your upcoming romantic escape awaits. I didn't cry. I didn't even blink. I clicked it, read the details, and began making calls. Not angry calls, legal ones, technical ones, quiet ones. I contacted the travel agency first, pretending to be Charlotte Alden, the name still attached to the reservation. Because legally, I still was. They confirmed everything: the beachfront suite, the private dinners, the 2 massage appointments scheduled under our names. I asked if I could make some changes. Of course, Miss Alden, the rep said cheerfully. You're the primary on the file. That phrase stuck with me. I was the primary, not her, not even him, me. I had the power to rearrange the fantasy they had scripted without asking my permission. So I did. First, I canceled the reservation. Full refund requested. Then I rebooked the suite in a different name, mine. Not Charlotte Alden, but the one I had just legally reinstated with the birth certificate from Topic 2. A name that bore no trace of Elaine's lineage. The new reservation was set for a woman arriving alone. I paid in full, upfront, from my own account. Then I called the credit card company. Adam had foolishly added me as an authorized co-user months before the engagement. He thought it was romantic, said he wanted me to feel like part of his world. He never removed my access. I logged in, viewed all active transactions, and revoked authorization. It took 10 minutes. 10 minutes to legally unlink myself from his financial ecosystem. 10 minutes to erase my trail and leave only confusion behind. I didn't go to the airport, but I watched. A friend at the airline, someone I had once helped during a law school internship, someone who owed me one favor, sent me the footage. Discreetly, it showed Adam at check-in, dragging 2 matching suitcases with designer tags. Behind him, Elaine in oversized sunglasses, smiling like a woman who thinks she's getting away with it. The desk agent typed something, then paused. Her face fell into protocol mode. She leaned forward, spoke softly. Adam's brow furrowed. Elaine leaned in. The agent showed them a screen. They both froze, then panic. He took out his phone, tried calling. No answer. Because I had already blocked his number. The agent pointed to a sign behind her. Next, please. I watched it in silence. I didn't smile. There was no satisfaction in seeing them humiliated, only closure, a kind of symmetry. They had tried to turn a celebration into a betrayal. I turned their betrayal into an echo chamber. I had already arranged everything. The suite now booked in my name would remain empty, paid for, waiting, a luxury mausoleum of what never was. And just to complete the circle, I left a message at the resort's front desk to be handed to any guest asking for the Charlotte and Adam suite. It was a single envelope. Inside, a handwritten note. Enjoy your time here. I didn't. Signed with the name Elaine hated most, my grandmother's maiden name. The same name she spent years mocking for being provincial. That's the name I now carried. And on the back of the card, printed in small gold lettering, was a quote she used to recite in her fake public speeches about resilience. Elegance is refusal. This time, I agreed. Elegance was refusing to scream, refusing to fight over scraps. Elegance was canceling a honeymoon with precision and replacing it with a reminder that they no longer controlled the narrative, that I had turned their game into mine, and they hadn't even seen the next move coming. The painting had been missing for 16 years. A still life oil on canvas of 3 ripe pears on a chipped porcelain plate, signed in the bottom right corner with the initials "Ra," my grandmother's. It wasn't her most famous work, not the one that hung in local galleries or earned her modest praise in university circles, but it was the one she kept above her fireplace, in a quiet room that always smelled faintly of cinnamon and rain-damp paper. She used to say that painting was for eyes that knew how to mourn without weeping. I was 8 the last time I saw it. I remember asking Elaine one day where it had gone. She told me my grandmother had probably sold it to pay taxes. I believed her. That was the kind of thing Elaine said often. Anything sentimental was a burden, and any burden could be repackaged as logic. Years later, cleaning out one of the storage units she had listed under a Shell LLC during her first divorce, I found it, wrapped in wool, cataloged under MISC, inventory. No frame, no mention, just dust and the quiet shame of a theft nobody ever confessed to. I didn't confront her, not directly. She would have denied it with that same amused smirk she used whenever I found her inconsistencies. But I took it, and I had it restored carefully, by a woman in Brooklyn who specialized in salvaging works forgotten in basements and attics. When she saw the signature, she paused. "Ra," she asked, "you know this painter was decades ahead of her time." I smiled. "I know." I kept the restoration quiet, wrapped the frame in acid-free paper and placed it in a temperature-controlled vault downtown. Then I made plans, not to display it but to release it, anonymously, as part of an auction Elaine would never resist attending. Every October, she bid at the Midtown Women in Art Gala, a masquerade of philanthropy where faded socialites fought over modernist sketches they didn't understand. She never missed it. It was her favorite event, not for the art, but for the chance to be photographed donating culture while wearing imported scarves. I reached out to the organizers under a pseudonym, told them I was in possession of a previously unreleased work by Ra, never exhibited publicly, but authenticated and restored. I sent proof. They practically begged me to include it in the catalog. I agreed with one condition. It had to be listed under a new title, not Still Life with Pears, but Inheritance Interrupted. They loved the drama, said it would drive bids. I didn't care about the price. I just wanted the moment. On the night of the auction, I arrived late, unrecognizable, new hair, neutral makeup, a dark green dress that hugged my posture like armor. I entered just as the painting was being unveiled. I watched Elaine from the far side of the room, sipping some pale cocktail through a straw she insisted on bringing herself, said hotel straws were too proletarian. She saw the painting, and I saw her freeze. Her eyes darted to the catalog, then back to the canvas, then to the auctioneer. I watched her shoulders square up, her hand gripping her paddle as if it were a weapon. She whispered something to the man beside her, some fourth husband or second banker. I didn't care. The bidding began. She entered immediately, aggressively, like someone reclaiming what was stolen from her, not something she had once stolen herself. Other bidders tried, but she outpaced them all. With each number she called, I imagined the thoughts in her mind. No one else knows. No one else has seen this. This is mine. Until a final voice broke through. Calm, measured. 160,000. The room turned. The bidder sat near the back, an elegant woman in her 50s, silver streak in her hair, wearing a brooch shaped like a broken locket. She was real, and she was mine, an actress, hired weeks before, trained to bid only if necessary, paid in full by me. She didn't blink. Elaine, now flushed, raised her paddle. 165. A pause. The woman nodded. 170. The gavel came down. The crowd clapped. Elaine's hands trembled. She'd lost. Not just the painting, but the narrative. Again, I approached the stage quietly after most had gone. The actress handed me the receipt. That was fun, she whispered. I nodded. Keep the painting, I said. Hang it somewhere warm. She looked at me. You sure? I smiled. She never earned it. You might. The moment wasn't about ownership. It was about lineage. Elaine had stolen a piece of my grandmother's soul and buried it like it was a tax error. I brought it back into the light and watched her fail to steal it twice. I didn't speak to her that night, but I knew she'd seen me. In the glass reflection of the gallery doors, I saw her mouth part, just slightly, like she might call my name. But no name came. Not mine, not hers, only silence. The kind of silence my grandmother used to paint with. Heavy, precise, final. They say memory is spatial, that the body returns to places long after the soul has moved on. I used to believe that was just poetic residue from grief, something writers said when they couldn't explain why we ache at the sight of certain chairs or the scent of certain flowers. But when I stood at the threshold of the grand hall again, 8 months after the non-wedding, I understood the violence of architecture. The altar was still there, polished, ornate, a marble platform with a gold filigree railing, positioned beneath a chandelier that dripped with fake elegance and crystal tears. I had once stood there, veil trembling in my hands, moments before placing my vows into the palms of the woman who had written them for another man. That altar had been the stage for my humiliation, and I intended to reclaim it, not by erasing what happened, but by letting it echo louder than ever before. I booked the venue under a new name, not mine, not Elaine's, just a foundation, one that didn't exist until I made it real. The Second Voice Collective. A name chosen for all the women who were told to lower their voices at family dinners, to smile smaller in bridal fittings, to bite their tongues while someone else wrote their future. I gave the hall a new purpose, not for flowers, not for photos, but for testimony. I invited 12 women, some I knew, some I didn't. I found them through support groups, late-night forums, anonymous essays published under trembling pseudonyms. Women who had been betrayed by sisters, cousins, fathers, best friends. Women who were told their pain was a misunderstanding, that their mothers didn't mean it, that their husbands had a moment of weakness, that silence was safer. I didn't offer them justice, just a microphone. A live stream was set up. Not grand, just a single camera, a steady feed, a caption that read, "We were supposed to say nothing." No hosts, no preamble. Just the women, stepping onto the same altar where I had once lost my voice and finding theirs. One by one, they spoke. A woman in her 40s whose sister married her ex and made her niece call her any mother. A former pastor's wife whose wedding was arranged by men who called it God's plan. A girl barely out of college who read the eulogy at her father's funeral, only to discover her mother had rewritten it behind her back. They didn't cry, not most of them. They read, they recited. They trembled but did not fall. And behind them, projected onto the back wall in soft amber light, were the words I had chosen weeks before. The altar was never yours to begin with. You just stood there. I didn't speak that night. I sat in the back row, alone, wearing black, Not out of mourning but declaration. Elaine came. I knew she would. She found out through someone she still believed was loyal. I had left no name on the invitation, no hint that I would be involved. But when she walked in and saw the stage, saw the camera, saw the name's second voice, I knew she felt it. Not recognition, revelation. She sat near the side, didn't speak, clutched her purse like it held something fragile, maybe her version of events, or maybe the last lie she'd told herself. At one point, a woman walked onto the stage, tall and severe, with a gaze like a locked cabinet. She began, "My mother always said I'd ruin everything if I spoke too loudly." She paused, then added, "So here's my volume now." The audience didn't clap. We didn't cheer. It wasn't that kind of night. It was reverent. It was reclamation. After the 12th woman stepped down, the lights dimmed. The feed cut. The stage went silent. I stood up, walked to the center, not to speak, but to place something small on the railing. A single white lily, not for purity, but because it was the flower my grandmother used to grow before Elaine ripped out the garden. I left it there, then turned and walked past her. Our eyes met briefly. She opened her mouth, almost to say something, but whatever it was, it died there, in that quiet, that second voice, that altar she had tried to make hers. I didn't need revenge that screamed. I needed truth that echoed. And now, that stage would echo long after her version of me had faded into dust. I didn't start writing it with an audience in mind. In truth, I began with nothing but a glass of cold wine, a locked door, and the kind of silence that doesn't soothe but settles into the bones like regret. I opened a blank document. No title, no outline, just a single sentence. My mother always said I was dramatic. She was right, because trauma always looks theatrical to the ones who caused it. From there, the story unraveled. Not chronologically, but viscerally. I didn't recount the betrayal as a sequence of events. I wove it like memory weaves itself out of texture, temperature, and repetition. I changed the names, of course. I called the protagonist Claire. Her fiancé became James, her mother simply the seamstress. Not for her profession, Elaine couldn't thread a needle to save her life, but for how she tailored pain into propriety, how she stitched betrayal into bloodlines without ever pricking her own fingers. I disguised the wedding as a harvest gala, the altar as a stage at a rural barn. I twisted details just enough to render them untraceable, not to protect her but to make sure the story stood without leaning on the crutch of headlines. Because this wasn't a tabloid tragedy, it was a ritual, one I knew too many women had endured. I didn't submit it to publishers. I left it on a small online platform for emerging writers, anonymously, with the tag Literary Fiction Revenge. Within a week, it had 20,000 reads. Within a month, it had a publisher's offer. I declined the first two. They wanted to soften the ending. One suggested turning the mother into a figure of redemption. Another wanted a romantic subplot. I responded with one sentence. The only redemption here is the silence that finally spoke louder than her name. Eventually, I found someone who understood. A small house, woman-owned, no frills, no edits. They printed it as it was, raw, rhythmic, and unflinching. It launched quietly. No press tour, no interview. Just a listing on a digital bookstore with a gold-foiled cover and a cryptic description. I didn't even watch the sales at first, but word spread, not through marketing but through mourning, through whispers in salons, screenshots in private message groups, quiet posts that began with, "I thought I was the only one." Then came the articles. The anonymous author who understands generational betrayal, the novel that dismantles the mother-daughter myth. The book climbed charts I never submitted it to. People began to speculate who the author was. Some guessed a retired therapist. Others assumed it was a pseudonym for a famous feminist essayist. None suspected me. Not yet. I waited. Not out of fear but out of preparation. When the invitation came for the book's first live reading held at a private literary forum in Boston, I accepted. Quietly. No announcement. No fanfare. Just a seat on stage. A small table. One copy of the book. I walked in wearing black again, this time with my hair pulled back, eyes neutral, no jewelry. I sat, opened the book, and read. Not the beginning but the middle. The chapter where Claire watches her mother pin her own betrayal like a corsage. The part where she writes a letter, then burns it, because there's no point sending smoke signals to the ones who set the fire. When I finished, I closed the book slowly, looked up, and said one line, "Thank you all for not believing me." The room didn't applaud. Not right away. They sat in it, that sentence. The venom beneath the gratitude. The way it made them complicit but also released. And then, someone stood. Then another, and another, until the silence turned into something else. Reverence. That night, my inbox exploded. I didn't respond. Not until I received one particular message. No sender name, no greeting, just a screenshot of Elaine in her kitchen, holding the book. Her face partially hidden behind the cover but the eyes visible, and the caption from her private account. Some stories hit too close to home. I didn't smile. I didn't feel triumph, just alignment. The truth had been released, not shouted, not dragged, just laid bare on shelves and passed hand to hand. My silence was never absence. It was strategy. It waited, crouched in the margins, until the stage was mine, until the mic was mine, until the world leaned forward. And now, the story that began as betrayal had become legacy, not in her voice, not in her tone, but in mine, unforgiving, unflinching, unapologetically heard. The call came at noon, a Tuesday. I remember because the sky outside my apartment, the new one, the one without any trace of shared wallpaper or inherited guilt, was unnervingly blue, the kind of color that makes you pause before answering the phone, like the weather might change depending on your response. The number was blocked. I answered anyway. Miss, he began, hesitating, not sure which surname to use, not sure who he was speaking to anymore. I said nothing, let the silence stretch, just long enough to make him nervous. I represent Miss Elaine Hartford, he said finally, his voice clipped and formal. She's filing a motion regarding emotional damages stemming from recent defamatory events tied to a certain publication. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. This was her last card, not confrontation, not apology, but paperwork. She couldn't rebuild her reputation, so she tried to dismantle mine, tried to weaponize legalese in place of language, since mine had reached farther than she ever expected. I let him finish his rehearsed threats, let him speak of reputational injury, mental distress, potential losses in her public image. He kept referring to the mother character in the book, as if fiction had a statute of limitations on memory, as if she could sue her own reflection. When he finally paused, waiting for my response, I took a slow sip of champagne. Real champagne this time, not the knockoff kind she used to buy and relabel as celebratory. The glass left condensation on my fingers. I was barefoot, relaxed, sitting on a balcony that overlooked a different city, a different coast, a different life. I'm afraid you've reached the wrong person, I said quietly. That woman doesn't exist anymore. There was silence on the other end, a shuffle of papers. I'm looking at a legal name change filed 2 months ago, he said. To confirm, are you saying you are not Miss Hartford? Legally, I said. I'm not anyone who owes her a response, and I hung up. That was the last contact I had with anyone from her camp. No more calls, no more letters, no more passive-aggressive emails with vague subject lines like clarity or closure. She had tried everything: control, shame, silence, inheritance, now litigation. But I had made my final move long before she ever picked up the pen. Everything had been shifted: my accounts, my residence, even the rights to the book, transferred to a trust operated by a women-led nonprofit in another country. The royalties now funded scholarships for girls estranged from their families. And the name I carried wasn't hers. It wasn't even mine originally. It belonged to my grandmother Ruth Ann, whose initials had been painted on a still life that once hung in the silence of a fireplace. I had taken her name, her strength, her unfinished legacy, and I had built something none of them could touch. That night, I hosted a small gathering. Nothing grand, just 6 women I had met along the way. One had walked out on her wedding 2 weeks before. Another had published her own memoir in the wake of a courtroom loss. Each of them carried their own war quietly, but they carried it with grace. We toasted with champagne, real names, real freedom, no more aliases, no more roles written by someone else. I didn't say much that evening, just one thing, as the glasses clinked under golden light. My revenge wasn't the scandal. It was this table, this silence, this peace. They understood. No one cheered, no one cried. We just sat, breathed, laughed eventually. The kind of laughter that comes after surviving a storm and realizing you're still dry, still whole. Somewhere across the country, I imagined Elaine pacing, spinning narratives for people who had already stopped listening. Her voice had once filled every room. Now, it echoed in her own empty hallways. I didn't need to check the court docket. I didn't need to watch the news. The real verdict had already been delivered in pages, in applause, in silence, and in the absence of my name from her life ever again. I finished my champagne, closed the window, and smiled not because I had won, but because she could no longer rewrite what I had already published in truth. In the end, Charlotte didn't just walk away from betrayal, she walked into power. Her silence became strategy, her pain became legacy, and her story, it became something no one could rewrite. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think twice about the cost of silence, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. More voices deserve to be heard. And here, we don't whisper, we speak loud enough to echo.